Hi there, and welcome to Learning to Turn with me, Bo LaGouge. We have arrived at the final episode of at least this first series of videos about the essential steps in making a bowl. The last things we have to do are to remove or at least reform the foot, what is currently the tenon. Doesn't look very good as the foot of a bowl, and to reshape this area here, possibly thinning the edge a bit in the process all the way down, but at the very least here where we had the shoulder for the tenon, that needs to be reshaped to blend into the shape of the bowl better. There are a number of ways of doing this. I'm not particularly familiar with any of them, honestly. The one that I've studied most through, of course, Stuart Batty, is what's called a jam chuck, a particular type of jam chuck. There are several. And the one that I'm going to be trying to use today is one that the inside lip of the bowl is going to meet onto the jam chuck here, which is basically a bowl blank that is fitted to the bowl that you're working on. So that will fit on here, and the top edge of the bowl will mate against the shoulder of the jam chuck. The advantages of this technique are that once you've gotten this on here, you have a good registration. You can take it off and put it back on to check how things are coming. It'll always go back on and register just perfectly. Other types where the jam chuck is fitting against the inside of the bowl, you can't do that nearly as well. The other great thing about this particular variety of jam chuck over the others is that once you have it on here and this inside face of the jam chuck is engaged to, mated to the inside lip or edge of the bowl, this bowl is now rigid. You no longer have any possibility of the wood deflecting as you're trying to cut into it. And when you get thin-edged bowls, that deflection is a major problem. So by having the solid jam chuck on the inside and tight against the inner lip, there's nowhere for the wood to go, and it's as if you're working on a solid piece of wood. It also has the advantage of the entire outside of the bowl being exposed. We'll get to the other technique that I'll be having to use here today in a minute, but it involves having the tailstock in here pressing against it to keep it from coming off, and that limits your ability to work. You know how the tool often is reaching across the lathe and the tailstock is in the way for that. By using this style of jam chuck with it held entirely by the jam chuck, I can get anywhere I want. I can work off this foot without any impediment and do a new cut on the outside, just like we did when we were shaping the bowl in the first place, with complete freedom of movement. So that's the preferred way to do it, at least according to Stuart Batty, my gospel. Unfortunately, I won't be able to do that with most of the bowls that I've turned in the course of these episodes because they have one kind of a flaw or another, a crack basically in the edge. Like this one, you can see a rather large one, and it's nicely detailed by the dark crack or dark wood around it. And this, obviously, if you were to put it onto a jam chuck, which is applying outward pressure, that would just expand that gap, possibly break the bowl, but at the very least, you would not have a good grip on the jam chuck. For that, then, there are, again, a number of possibilities. The one that I'm going to be trying are what are called Cole jaws, C-O-L-E, Cole jaws. They're mounted to a chuck just like this. And so this expands and contracts when you tighten it. These little nubbies here will engage, and I haven't taken time to put this in the right size, but those little nubbies will engage the outside of the bowl. That will be putting compressive pressure instead of expansive pressure, and the cracks then will not be compromised in the same way. It'll actually help to push things together. So I'll be using this on probably, it looks like about 8, maybe 10 of the bowls that we turned in the course of this series to at least be able to take off the tenon here and reshape a little bit around the shoulder of the old tenon. I won't be able to work all the way down the outside of the bowl because obviously I don't want my gouge to run into the coal jaws. That would be bad. So those are the two things we're going to be doing. There are no new cuts in this episode. The operations with the gouge are basically things that we've done before in the course of flattening the end, forming the tenon, and shaping the outside of the bowl. So none of that is new. This is just new operations to finish the bowl. Gee, I can't think of anything else to say here, but of course I have the voiceover to add anything that I've missed. So I'm going to get set up here and have my first go at using a jam chuck. And wish me well. Hopefully I don't bust the thing and have it fly across the shop, as has happened a number of other times. So here we go. See you on the other side. Welcome to the voiceover for the final episode of this series. As you can see, we're starting a little bit ahead of the game here because I wanted to have a formed jam chuck ready to see in the introduction. So this one has already been somewhat prepped. Obviously, I didn't get it as far as having it perfectly fitted to this particular bowl. There are two requirements for a good jam chuck fit. One is that it is good and snug, holds onto the bowl, and the second is that you can push the bowl all the way on until the lip of the bowl is fully engaged or registered against the shoulder of the jam chuck. Achieving either one of those is quite easy. Getting them both is rather difficult, at least for me and my skill level. You just saw me struggling to get the bowl off. I had achieved plenty of snugness, but not a fit that allowed it to reach all the way up to the shoulder. And so getting it off was difficult. Luckily, that little crack there let me put something in that I could use to pry it off. Here I'm using the tailstock, and I was just taking the pin center off of it, so it's a flat surface. But I'm using the tailstock to hold it on while I'm shaving down the jam chuck so that its outer edge is flush with that of the outside of the bowl. That flush surface across the two pieces is key for being able to get this tape on there well to hold the bowl onto the jam chuck. It's a safety precaution because you're otherwise just relying on that jam chuck to hold on to the bowl as you're working on it and not creep off. Remember, you only have maybe an 1/8, 3/16 of an inch of contact there between the inside lip of the bowl and the jam chuck to hold it on there, and the masking tape prevents it from creeping and coming off, so it's just a security measure. Here you see me recessing the center of the foot a bit. It's both an aesthetic thing, but also make sure that the bowl is sitting on the rim of that foot. You don't want it to have any part toward the center that's proud of the edge of that lip, or else the bowl won't sit flat. And here I am reshaping the edge, the shoulder, taking it off to give it a nice smooth transition from the bottom to the side of the bowl. And I found that remarkably easy to pull off. There I'm using a bit of a pull cut, which is something you haven't seen me do a lot, but in order to get into that corner at the edge of the foot, that was a better way to get in there. I think that I was doing a much better job on a clean push cut around the edge there than I was accomplishing when first shaping the outside of the bowl. I certainly wasn't getting the micro grooves that I had such a problem with from the lathe wobbling. Now I have taken the tape off so that I can finish the shaping, finished cut around all the way up to the lip. I probably should have brought the tailstock up to hold it on, since the tape is off of there, and it wouldn't be in the way for this particular cut around the edge, or top edge of the bowl. But I get lucky here and it doesn't come off. I'm not going to go deep into sanding here. Generally you want to sand at the slowest speed possible, so I should have turned the lathe down there as I sanded it, but I didn't. This lathe doesn't go as slow as I'd like for sanding. One thing that happens when you sand is tool marks that you thought weren't so bad. Oh, watch here. I believe this is where I have trouble getting it off. And watch what happens when it finally comes. Whoops! I was lucky not to drop that on the floor. And of course now it is at its thinnest, the thinnest it's going to be, because I'm done with it. It would be a real drag to drop it and have it crack in the floor. Alright, that's one down. Here you get to see how tedious the process of getting that good fit can be. It's going to take a number of tries, each time turning off the lathe, trying it on there, and that time I actually went too far. So now it's loose. Obviously that's where I got the second part of the equation. I got a real easy, nice fit to the shoulder, but it doesn't have the friction, the grip against the jam chuck to actually hold it on. So the remedy there is just to cut deeper, farther back, basically a new shoulder, and then because it's going deeper, you need to kind of carve back the inner part, the dome of the jam chuck, so that it's not hitting against the bottom of the bowl or anywhere except at the lip. That actually leads me to one place that I'm diverging from Stuart, if you can believe it, which is in the couple of videos I saw him doing jam chucks, he always had basically a bowl-shaped blank that he was using as the jam chuck, and I suspect that he then ends up finishing that off and turning the jam chuck into a bowl of its own. What I've taken to doing is using a chunk of like a 2x10 or 2x12 that I flatten on the lathe. Often has, it's cheap lumber, it often has a bit of a bow or whatever to it, warp, but you mount that on the lathe and you can flatten it up and get it all nice and true, and it makes a perfectly good jam chuck. And in that case it saves you the hassle of working the dome of the jam chuck down to make sure it's not interfering with the inside or touching the inside of the bowl, because there is no dome on that 2x10, and all you really care about for the functional structural purposes of the jam chuck is that lip and shoulder. You don't need the dome. That's not serving any purpose to have wood kind of extending deeper inside that you're not making contact with. So I think we're getting close here. No, not quite. You can see quite a gap there. So it's going to take a few more tries. Each time you have to stop the lathe and grab the bowl and put it back on, see how it goes. And I don't have the touch for this yet, so it's a lot of trial and error and getting it just right. If you try to force it on when you haven't quite made it small enough, then you're putting more pressure than the bowl may be able to take. So you definitely need to make it small enough, but if you make it too small, then you're back to square one. And, digging deeper to make a new one. Of course, the advantage is you have the old one that was too small to judge from, and you just make sure you don't go as small as that was. So these first two bowls are both olive. I believe we end up with 4 olive bowls that all made it through the entire process. You'll notice that pretty much all the cuts I make here are quite light. Taken off less than 1 millimeter of wood per pass in most cases. The best of jam chucks is not nearly as secure and solid as a regular chuck, so you just can't put as much stress into taking a bigger cut. Of course, we're also at the finished end stage of the process, so you're generally not looking to remove large amounts of wood. The exception being the tenon, where I'm taking it from, I think mine were probably more than 1/4 of an inch, and I'm taking it down to just like a 1/16 or maybe a little bit more. And so I could have tried to do that in a deeper pass, but much better to take 3 or 4 or 5 passes to nibble it down and not risk messing with your jam chuck failing on you. One problem with working with a jam chuck is that you basically lose easy access to checking on the thickness. How much wood do you have left? Because it's all taped up and you can't measure with a caliper or anything how thick you're getting and whether you're maintaining an even thickness. The beauty of the jam chuck over just about any other option here is that you can take it off if you need to and put it back on, and it will be perfectly registered. Just the nature of the jam chuck. Here, let me interrupt myself to say I'm using a scraper. Here I was really unhappy with how much tool marks I had left, and I didn't want to take another pass with the bowl gouge, because there you kind of need to take a minimum amount of wood in order to have good tool control. At least I do. I don't have the ability to do a feather thin pass with a bowl gouge, and using a scraper allows you to take just shavings off. And this would qualify as a new type of cut. I'm really not qualified to try to tell you anything about it other than the one thing I know is that anytime you're using a conventional scraper, you need to have it angled down, as you could see I was doing there, so that it doesn't grab the wood and get a big tear out. I have no idea whether the angle I'm using is proper or not. I haven't really watched videos of this technique, use of this tool. Here I'm using it must be about a 1/2 inch, maybe 5/8 inch square end scraper. In a couple of minutes on one of the next bowls, I'll be using a big bull nose or round nose scraper. And it was a bit unnerving to be grabbing a tool that I hadn't studied up on at all and putting it to the edge of a bowl that's otherwise nearly complete. But it definitely helped to get the tool marks out. Whether I would have been able to take them out satisfactorily with sandpaper, I don't know. I'm certainly aiming for results off of the tool that allow me to start sanding with like maybe 120, 180 grit sandpaper. I hear a lot of turners, and including people that I am really impressed with the quality of the work they do, of the bowls they turn out, who like to start with like 60 or 80 grit sandpaper. I'm sure there will be times when I need to do that, but my aim is to get closer to a finished product off of the tool. There you can see I resorted to grabbing a pair of rubbery gloves to help get the bowl off, and that worked much better. Didn't drop it. Alright, blank number 3. This one is not olive. I'm not sure what type of wood it is. One thing worth pointing out here is, since I had a series of bowls, I think a total of 5 to do, I took the time to measure the inside diameter of each one and stage them. So I was starting with the largest bowl, and I could use the same jam chuck, just making it progressively smaller. And at least the way I'm doing it, the jam chuck is a waste piece. Like I say, I think maybe Stuart is in the habit of using the jam chuck and turning it into a bowl in its own right. Yeah, see, it fell off there. I was not using the tailstock. I think I was figuring, well, I'm really cutting on the jam chuck, not on the bowl. But clearly I got enough contact with it that it came flying off of there. And I think it may have cracked a little bit when it hit the ground, which is why upon trying to put it back on, it didn't have a tight fit anymore. Obviously it wasn't a super tight fit to begin with, but it was a lighter, looser fit after dropping it than it was before. Once again, having to reduce the dome. So where was I? I was talking about, for me, the jam chuck is a throwaway piece. I'm cutting it down to serve my purposes, and by the time I'm done, there's not going to be enough left to do anything with. And of course, as I said, I'm generally not, I don't remember the last time that I used what I'd consider a bowl blank for a jam chuck instead of a piece of 2x10, 2x12. And there I make the mistake of pushing too hard.
That's not good.
I hadn't brought it down to size, and I decided to try and force it, and that was a piece of wood that wasn't too structurally sound to begin with. Like I say, it probably was cracked from dropping it on the floor. But regardless, pushing it on the way I did there was just plain stupid. And the result was maybe 2 halves of a bowl. So on to blank number 4. And there I made the mistake pretty much right out of the gate of making the jam chuck too small, so we're already on to attempt number 2. And you can see I'm down to just maybe an inch of wood behind the shoulder. So this jam chuck is getting near the end. I don't have a lot more to work with here, and I'm hoping to make it work for this bowl and one more. You might notice that I'm cutting kind of uphill there, not the normal direction I would be cutting to shape a bowl, but here I don't really care if it has torn grain, if it's a ragged cut, because this is a throwaway piece, and it saves me from repositioning the tool rest to do the cut the way I would normally do it. overall, I felt this whole process went reasonably well. It was tedious to get it fitted right, but it sure works well. Once you get it fitted on there, the ability to work the entire outside of the bowl is a real blessing. I've used a few other techniques now. There's a variation on a jam chuck, which often is referred to as a jam chuck, but I believe it's more properly known as a compression chuck. And in that case, all you're doing is fitting the bottom of the inside of the bowl against something. Some people use just a regular chuck with some kind of padding over it. Others have like basically a wooden piece that is held in a jaws in a chuck and fits inside the bowl. Various shapes I've seen, and the way the bowl is held on there is using the tailstock. So it's a compression chuck where it's just friction between that whatever's on the inside of the bowl and the face of the bowl, and then the tailstock holding it in place. That's a method I don't see myself ever using, because I have one of the other options now, which is a vacuum chuck, where you have a vacuum generator, in my case a vacuum pump. Other people I've heard of using an actual like shop vac, which seems like it would be awfully noisy. Or apparently there's some device you can use with a compressor where I believe it's called a Venturi something or other. In any case, you're creating a vacuum, and then you have a special kind of attachment in place of it's a different type of chuck, which has a hole in the middle and seats against the inside of the bowl. And so the vacuum that's coming in through the headstock, there's a hole in the headstock. That vacuum is just holding the bowl onto the vacuum chuck. And I've used that a number of times to pretty good effect. I still prefer the compression chuck, but there are cases where that's not a great option, like if you have a compromised bowl with cracks. Then the vacuum chuck is better. I did make a mistake one time. I had taken the bottom of the bowl too thin, like really thin, and I knew that, and I still put it on the vacuum chuck, and the force of the vacuum sucked out the bottom of the bowl. So it was a rather ragged looking funnel, because instead of being nicely, cleanly cut by a bowl gouge, it was sucked out by a vacuum. As much as I like the jam chuck of the options that I'm aware of, it does have one major limitation, which is it really only works with a bowl where the lip is basically parallel sides. That is, where the lip is basically perpendicular to the base. So if you have a bowl where the edge flares out, and then you basically don't have the internal lip that you need to engage the chuck. If you were to form a jam chuck that fits that flaring edge, there would be no hold. It just wouldn't stay on there. Maybe with enough tape you could keep it on there, but it's just not, it wouldn't work nearly as well. I wouldn't even probably try it. So far I haven't tried any bowls in kind of different shapes. Because I like using the jam chuck, I'm stuck with shaping the bowls in a way that I can use a jam chuck. but that is a consideration. If you're inclined to to do other shapes of bowls, then you'll have to resort to another technique for finishing the outside of the bowl. And fortunately, you do have options. You may have noticed that in addition to Bounder passing through the shot periodically, we have a visitor today. The kind of gold-colored dog is Benny. That's my daughter-in-law's dog, who was visiting for a week or so, about the time I was shooting this, obviously. And you can see he's a rather more active dog than Bounder, where Bounder might come through once every 10 or 15 or 20 minutes. Benny is just back and forth, and whereas I was previously putting up a little graphic to call out when Bounder came through, I'm not going to be doing that for Benny, or that graphic would be up pretty much all the time. Here we are. I've resorted to a scraper again. This time it's the bullnose. I think it's a 2-inch bullnose from Hurricane as the manufacturer. In addition to not knowing with any real certainty how to use this, other than the fact that you should keep it pointed downhill, I also don't know much about sharpening it, the angle, the technique, and so forth. As with any tool, sharpness matters, and I just don't remotely have the skill to put it on the grinder and get that proper edge all the way around. I'm not even sure about the angle that it should be ground at. So once again, I'm not going to try and advise you at all on the use of scrapers, other than that they're a good tool for taking out tool marks. Stuart Batty, if you've watched his videos, you'll know that he's a big advocate of a type of scraper called negative rake scraping, and I'm not going to try to explain that to you here, but it's a different shape that has advantages for not being as prone to catching. I think I interrupted myself once before when I was talking about sanding. That one thing that sanding does is, if you have tool marks that you hadn't really noticed, the sanding will make them pop, because you're sanding off the high spots and your sandpaper is barely touching the underlying lower spots, and that contrast between sanded wood and wood off the tool, it stands out a whole lot more. There have been a number of times when I thought the wood was in decent shape and I probably didn't need to do a lot of sanding, if any, and once I started sanding, I had a lot of work to do, because it was, the tool marks came out, and honestly, I think I might have been better off in those cases just living with the finish off the tool. All right, that is the last bowl that we're going to be doing. Obviously, you should recognize it by now. That is Olive, and I think my favorite bowl of the bunch, with the light stripe passing across the bottom. And so now we switch to the cold jaws. And here in general, you should always have the tailstock in place, because there's really not much holding that bowl in the cold jaws. I'm pretty sure we're going to have at least an occasion or two where I don't heed that and I pay the consequences. This is a technique that I will avoid as much as possible. I have the cold jaws, inherited them from my dad, and will probably keep them around, but they'll be a last resort for me. Not even sure what circumstances would lead me to use them, but I do not like them. For one thing, and this is on me. Before I get into that, we just had a structural failure. Got a little bit of a catch. It tore some wood out, and that went all the way through the bottom. So pretty rough tear out, not reparable, I don't think. And it was some pretty punky wood right across the middle there. Part of the reason it tore as badly as it did when I had a bit of a catch. So on to the second bowl on the jam chuck, and you'll notice right off the bat that I do not have the tailstock in place. It's right there, I can see it. I have no excuse for not using it. There we go. I got smart. One problem with this particular set of coal jaws is the little rubber nubbies on there. My dad passed away in 2007. It's now 2000. Well, it was, I guess, 2021, early 2021 when I recorded this. So those rubber nubbies have been around for 14 years without any use, and I have no idea how long he had them before that. Rubber does tend to degrade over time, so they don't have quite the resilience and rubberiness that they probably should have. That would be easily remedied. You can buy new nubbies for them, and any seasoned turners out there are probably rolling their eyes and saying they're not called nubbies, but I have no idea what they are called, so I'm going to stick with nubbies. I find it a bit unnerving to get in close there and do anything with those big metal plates spinning around and the rubber nubbies that I'd imagine would be keen to grab anything that came close to them. And I believe we just made a funnel. A much neater funnel than the one that I created by tear out before. This time I just carved through the bottom. I don't think we're going to get a look at it here, but I suspect this is in part a case of the bottom when I was using get a bit of a look, but not well enough to see. When I was working with the bottom bowl gouge, I probably left more of a divot there at the very center. Not a smooth, gradual curve, but a compound curve where it basically a divot in the bottom, which basically went down into the area of the tenon. So when I removed the tenon, I got right down into a hollow. There are lots of ways of making funnels, and in my rather short time turning, probably up to about 40 bowls that I've tried, I've exercised a number of the funnel making techniques. I think I did 3 in a row that I did back in June. Oh look, there's another one. 3 in a row right here, I guess. But yeah, even in last summer when I thought I had gotten a bit better, I made 3 funnels in a row. All 3 of them I managed to save. The first 2 I cleaned up the hole and then formed a plug to go in there, which also functioned as a foot. Those worked out okay. And the third one, I decided the gods were trying to tell me that they wanted a funnel, so I actually finished it as a funnel, cleaned up the hole, and then instead of a foot, I formed a structure that fits right over the top of a mason jar. Gave it to some neighbor friends who do a lot of canning, and apparently they use it frequently to help get stuff into their jars. You'll notice that the last couple of bowls, and here's the third one since we switched to the coal jaws, where I have not been using the tailstock. That's just plain idiotic. There's really nothing holding that thing in there securely, and if you have cold jaws or you get them, don't ever do this. Those ones that turned into funnels probably were doomed to be funnels regardless, but I shouldn't have ever gotten there using cold jaws, because I should have been on the tailstock, and it would have prevented me from getting to that point. Here I'm trying to clean up the bottom and give that little bit of a recess, and now working on the shoulder to reshape that. That foot is a bit thicker than I would normally want. I probably realized that this was another funnel in the making had I gone deeper, because of the same kind of a divot toward the center of the bowl that extends down into that the tenon area. So if I had made the foot thinner, it would have gotten there. This isn't the most spectacular bowl of the bunch that we made here, but it does have some nice grain to it. There's a bit of figure, particularly on one side, where the grain does some interesting things. Otherwise, it's kind of nondescript wood. I'm not even sure what kind. I'm pretty sure it's not oak, actually, but probably from my wood pile. But I'm pleased that this one made it through. Yeah, right there around the knot is where there's some interesting grain, especially on the inside. Moving on to number 10 here. Look at this. This piece has a number of cracks. It's really remarkable that it made it this far. And when I grabbed it to put it on the cold jaws here, I had no illusions that it was going to survive this final step. And of course I'm doing myself no favors by yet again not using the tailstock to keep it in place. But I figured since it had made it this far, I owed it to give it a chance, to not just give up on it. And besides, even if it does come apart at this point, it doesn't have a lot of mass and is not likely to do me any harm. So here we go. Let's see how it works out. Cutting a recess here in the foot so that it will sit flat. And the result was a catch which would have torn any bowl out of the cold jaws without anything to hold it in there, but in this case, not only tore it out, but tore it up. I found 3 pieces, and I think there were a few shards that got lost. And you can kind of see there a bit of a catch right there where the tool dug in. And that was the end of that one. Moving on to number 11. Yet again, no tailstock. Light scraping passes. I think scraping is probably not the safest way to be cutting here, even if I had a tailstock. Scrapes can be prone to catching much more than a slicing cut, at least in my limited experience. Working on the shoulder, blend that in. I can't tell you how weird it is to watch yourself on video doing something that's pretty stupid like this, of not using the tailstock. I don't know if I knew at the time that I was supposed to and just decided to not do it, or if I was just that ignorant that I didn't even know better. At the risk of dropping a spoiler, this one actually does survive to the end, in spite of my best efforts to blow it up. And I'm happy it does, because it's actually a decent bowl. It's not super dramatic, not the prettiest of wood, but the grain ends up being pretty nice. Touch of sandpaper. Should not probably be wearing the gloves there for safety purposes. Given that there's no tool rest in play, there's not a lot of risk to it, I don't think. But generally, you'll see people say don't ever work with gloves on at a lathe. The risk here would probably be mostly if I got caught up in the nubbies on the coal jaws, more than the reason I'm wearing the glove is to protect my fingertip from the heat of that sandpaper. It gets uncomfortably hot. I should have also turned down the lathe speed to reduce the amount of friction and heat buildup. And here we're going to get a look inside at kind of the prettier part of this one, and I'll turn it over to myself in the original audio. I declare that one a keeper. That's got some beautiful grain. Never mind the cracks. That one dark stain there is not real pretty, but man, there's some nice shimmer in there. I have since learned that the proper name for that shimmer is chatoyance, which I believe may have originated as a terminology in gemstones for the kind of glimmer that you get inside from something about the alignment of the layers of the atoms in there, but basically the same effect in wood, that certain folds in the grain provide a three-dimensional effect that's quite striking. Well, we have reached bowl number 12, the last of the bunch. And that means basically we've come to the end of the series. I'll tell you, this has been a much greater undertaking than I think I ever anticipated. Turns out recording the videos was the easy part. Editing them and recording these voiceovers has proven to be a much bigger undertaking. It's stretched out over the last 6 months. Never thought I'd spend so much time looking at my own gut. It's not a particularly satisfying experience. Happy to report that I've dropped 10 pounds since then and improved my posture, which is the main reason I look like I'm out of shape. If you've made it this far, you're either a friend or family, or you learned something, or I guess possibly you're just a masochist. I suppose it could be some combination of the three, but I certainly hope you've found something useful in all of this. And if you're just at that point of thinking about wanting to turn, but feeling like it's a bit of an overwhelming thing to learn, I hope this has demonstrated to you that you can start with almost nothing and get to a point of being reasonably competent in a not too long a period of time. And now I'll toss it back to myself one last time for some closing thoughts. Well, folks, that is the last bowl, at least from this batch. Hopefully more to come. Say this is a decent keeper. Oh boy, there's some, yeah, I remember this. Got some real waveform here from this flap. I couldn't maintain a good edge on the inside of that one with the way this thing was flapping around. But all in all, it's not a bad looking bowl, at least for a rookie like me. Let's see. I'll probably come back out here at some point and show you the results of all of these things, and kind of the winners and the losers. The pile of losers is considerably larger than the winners. But as I said early on, beginning, the goal here was not to make a bunch of bowls that I could give away and make gifts out of and put on my own shelf, as much as to learn the process, and I'm pleased with how that went. So I'd call this a success. Hope it has been for you too. Cheers. Well, that about does it for Learning to Turn with Beau Legouge, at least the initial series. As I've said more than once, the goal here was not to create finished bowls as much as to practice the steps involved in making a bowl. But I thought it would be worth reviewing how things went along the way. We had 27 blanks go through the mill in the course of this series. 7 of them resulted in bowls that are worth keeping. 20 of them didn't make it out the other side. And I thought we should take a minute to walk through these and see what went wrong with each of them of the 20 that augured in. Start here with a couple that failed rather catastrophically early on. This, I think, was the first one, and looking at it, you can see what the problem was. This had a crack almost all the way across. As I thinned it down even further, you only had this piece right here that was still attached. The rest of this clearly had been cracked for a long time, had water pass through it and dirt collect. So this was doomed from the start. I just didn't realize how bad that crack was. But that one came apart in a big way. This one was not far behind it. I believe this one failed as I was working down the stump here in the center before reversing it, but it would not have lasted long had I gotten as far as reversing it, because clearly it had a pretty bad crack through it. I guess I kind of learned my lesson from those two, because we have these 3 that I voluntarily took out of the game. This one, I don't know why I ever thought to put it on the lathe in the first place. It's super irregular, has all sorts of flaws through it. It's actually not too bad in terms of cracks, but by the time I carved all of this bad stuff off of there, I'm not sure there would have been enough left for a thimble. So I wisely took that one out. This was one of several chunks of pear wood that I was going to try to turn, and I think all of those are doomed. They cracked pretty badly before I managed to get the stuff on to keep them from drying too rapidly, and clearly that one was not going to have enough structural stability to make it to the end. This one got a little bit farther. I had not only flattened the one side and cut the recess, but rounded it out and flattened the second side. And at that point, it became clear that this crack here was way too deep and intrusive, and that it was not going to make it any further. I probably shouldn't have taken it that far. So that one fell by the wayside. Now we get into ones that I had actually reversed and was working on the outside, shaping the outside of the bowl. This one, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this on camera, but as I pull on here, and I could tell it's a whole lot better with the strength of the chuck to expand it, but that crack there runs pretty much all the way across. It probably wouldn't have survived, but at any rate, I didn't even have a good grip on the chuck because it was flexing from expanding there. This one I really had hopes of trying to make work. It has a crack through here. I put some super glue in it and thought about maybe giving it a go, but as I looked at it, the crack makes it all the way around here. Really, it probably only has maybe a third of that wood still holding it together. So unfortunately, it had to go. It would have been the only one I tried in this round, called a live edge bowl, where it basically reversed, where the center would have been on the bottom, the center of the wood. If you can see the grain here, would have been the bottom of the bowl instead of at the top, like most of these. But crack doomed it. Another one that I voluntarily took out of the race. I'd gotten as far as putting the tenon on there, but as I looked at it, the cracks here were too much. So I got to turn the outside of it, but gave up on it at that point. This one, I think I knew from the start was just a practice piece and wasn't going to make it all the way to the end with these major flaws here. So again, I got to practice turning the outside, but it wasn't meant to be for that. Another one that failed in the course of turning the outside, shaping the outside. This one you may recall, as I was getting to the lip, it got a little bit of a catch, and this part came off, which of course meant I no longer had a good seat for the chuck. Clearly it had a bad crack across there. I am going to give this one another try because I figured if I put it back between centers, turn this down to that point, it's actually a decent piece of wood. Beyond that, it has a couple of more minor cracks, but I think they'll be minor enough for me to give this one another go. So that one goes over here for future attention. These not so lucky. This is one of the ones where I didn't even ever find the piece that came off of it. That's going to be one of the surprises for the next year or two, is finding chunks of these that didn't show up in the initial investigation. But as this was in the course of hollowing it out, crack along the side here, and that whole side failed. So that's kindling. Another one much like that in the course of hollowing it out. Still plenty of wood, not remotely thin, but must have had cracks that just weren't meant to make it to the finish line. Now we get down to ones that were pretty far along in the course of hollowing out. This one, it's about as thin as I wanted to take it. I was just trying, if I recall correctly, to clean up some of the interior cuts when these two sides gave way. Probably wasn't going to be too beautiful of a bowl, although it does have some nice wavy grain through here. Don't know if that's going to show up on camera, but it had a little bit of promise in the grain, but otherwise not much going for it. Also, I'm not sure this will show up either, but ignore the, there we go. I think you can see that. This one was about to fail in the same way as the next two that we're going to look at. I was very close to cutting through and leaving nothing but the tenon in the chuck, which is exactly what happened with these two. This is what's left. I'm not going to try and put it together on camera here, but this is what's left of the first one where I cut through the bottom and had nothing but this left in the chuck. And again, as I was handling this stuff on a previous take of this segment, I realized that I had darn near gone through the bottom of that one before I even reversed it for the final cleanup of the outside. So this one was pretty well doomed in two different ways before it finally it found it had no wood left to hold it together and disintegrated rather spectacularly. Sorry I didn't get that one on tape for you. This is the other one that failed in the same way, so this was all that was left in the chuck. Fortunately, I had the cameras rolling for this one. It came apart much more cleanly, actually fits together pretty nicely with just a bit of wood missing around the bottom there, but yeah, I lost track of where the bottom was. I guess that's not so uncommon in this line of hobby. Let's see, now we get to ones that failed once I was working with them on the jam chuck. So here, as I tried to fit it onto the jam chuck, it had a pretty bad crack. Again, you can see the discoloration here from infiltration of dirt and stuff from water. But as I tried to push it onto the jam chuck, that crack just gave and turned it into kindling. This is the one that I would have been shocked if it had survived jam chucking it. It had the several cracks on the one side, I think on this side as well, that had it seriously compromised. But I figured at that point, what's the harm in trying? It's small and light enough that if it comes apart, even if a part of it had hit me, it wouldn't hurt too much. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Can't remember exactly what I was doing at the moment it disintegrated, but there was no real surprise in there. And the three that were so close. that bottom came out of them during the final cuts. This one was not so much a cutting too thin as that this was really punky wood, so it grabbed the chisel as I was trying to take the stump off there, what was left of the tenon, and tore itself out. So there was poor structural integrity right there at the bottom. Unfortunate. I think it might have looked decent with finish on there to bring that grain out, but so be it. This one was not a real pretty bowl, but this is the first one where I just cut too deep here, and I was pretty sure it wasn't going to make it. I knew I had gone a little too deep on the inside, but hey, if you're going to keep it, you got to get some of that tenon off, or it doesn't look any good anyway. So give it a go, and sure enough, it broke through. And same went here, although this time it was much slighter, just a little bit of a hole, really a funnel, as I guess these things are called in this line. And I'm thinking about pouring a little bit of epoxy into there, let that dry, and I wouldn't even actually have to do anything more on the outside because I'd gotten to the point where it's recessed there and sits clean. So we'll see what happens if I put a little tape on this side and a little epoxy in there to fill that hole, and then how it looks once I get finish on it. But I think it's worth giving it that little extra effort. All right, that brings us to the 7 survivors. I'm not going to spend much time on these, largely because there's no great story of what went wrong, because they actually survived. But we have one that's oak, some decent grain on there. I really like the way that looks, even though it's obviously not going to be used for soup or anything. But yeah, I think that turned out okay. Worth keeping. These two, I couldn't even tell you what kind of wood they are. I'll show some of my turning friends and see if they can tell me what I'm working with here. I think I said when I turned this one, I really like the way the grain came out here and over here. I think it'll look pretty neat when it's got finish on it. And that brings us to the prize pieces of the bunch. The 4 from the olive wood. And the grain on here is the best of anything I've touched. I think this one and this one are probably my favorites. This one's still pretty thick, but that's what I decided to do in order to keep from cutting all the way down through the light colored wood there and having that grain basically taper out on me. And of course, way imperfect here with that crack across the lip. But all in all, that one will look nice on a shelf somewhere. And this one I really like. Managed to make it thin, still got the good grain through the bottom, and spectacular around the outside. So I say this is the best of the bunch, for my money anyway. So there we go. 7 to keep and 20 for the wood pile. You know, those will go into my fire pit and keep us warm on a spring night. All in all, successful outing as far as I'm concerned. I hope you all learned something from watching. And if enough people watch these things, and who knows, maybe I'll make some more for you. Cheers.